The points here are mostly for your view, and I've put in the Quranic verses dealing with this. And I do believe you will in any case find this useful because it has in it pretty much everything that deals with this particular question. Now, and there are some things which are good and some things which are bad on this kind of dialogic argument that might exist. But I guess the bottom line is this in interreligious dialogue. There are various forms of interreligious dialogue, one of which is pursued by a professor in my department who has the World Dialogue Project. And it is viewed by myself, as well as my non-Muslim colleagues, as being a hegemonic project, because his method of dialogue is, okay, here we are, we've put our beliefs on the table, now what will you put on the table? As if religious belief is something that you can bargain over. And going beyond that, he has made a list of world ethics, universal ethics, and he says, I'm going to take this to the United Nations so the United Nations can vote this into effect and impose it on every place. And that is simply a kind of intrusive, penetrating, hegemonic imperialism of thought that will not work because it will provoke the other. And it may be that sometimes we do provoke the other when we talk, but if we were to get acquainted across the divisions of religion and ideology, and I include ideology if someone has an idea, well, I don't belong to a religion and I don't believe in a religion. So I'm combining both. A dominant kind of thinking that rules your own life, which could be religion, it might be a traditional religion, it could be a private religion of your own, or it could be some kind of ideological commitment. And some people will say, well, I have no ideological commitments. I'm a complete agnostic, I don't believe in anything, and so on. But actually, that's not true. Everyone has some kind of past that has formed them and leads them to have certain types of commitments. And a person is being more realistic with themselves if they recognize that they have some kind of pre-commitments or other. And those could be very reasonable pre-commitments. It's not anything I'm arguing against. But the whole point here of the dialogue would be that instead of following my colleagues' hegemonic, or shall I put it in a maybe fairer phrasing, homogenizing version of interreligious dialogue, instead of following that and trying to homogenize everything, to minimize differences and say they don't exist and ignore them and pretend there are none and so on, it's far more realistic to engage in a real exchange of ideas, even if your ears are wounded by the discourse of the other and you hear what you do not like. Now, of course, that requires a great deal of tact and coolness and so on to not fly off the handle, and everyone cannot handle that, but it is necessary. The first thing is to recognize the legitimate basis of the other. And that means that the other has their own construction of their religion and the whole belief system and social system that comes out of that. The other has their own construction of that, and that has to be honored. What the other says about themselves, that is what you have to go with. And Muslims have been and still are just as prone to error on this point as anyone else in the world. Because Muslims will go and say, well, Judaism is blah, 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 and Christianity is blah, 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 and so on, making invidious comparisons and using that to validate their own religion and ideology. That has historically always been the way that people have worked. But it is only fair and right that people be more accurate about this. And accuracy is achieved by allowing the other to represent itself. Now, the role of technology and science here is that unlike the independent thought universes of the past, where each civilization existed sort of hermetically sealed and often had rules to enforce that. For example, the pre-modern Chinese rule, which as far as I know, it prevailed until the Opium War of 1839 to 1842, that no foreigner was allowed to ever learn Chinese. It was prohibited for foreigners to learn Chinese. Obviously, if foreigners cannot learn the language of 99% of your population, they cannot reach that population, and so that's isolation for you. And there were many hermit kingdoms, that is, kingdoms that refused at first to be, quote, opened by the West, unquote. Not only Japan, when Perry went there, but China, similarly, when Lord Macaulay went to Beijing in 1793, and his mission utterly failed, and he was totally rejected by the Chinese emperor. Burma, which fought wars to keep itself separated off from the West. And so. But the world we live in now isn't that world anymore. That world is dead. And anyone who thinks that we can go back to that world, it's over, it's finished. And maybe that's unfortunate and is something that one could bemoan, although others will not bemoan it. We'll say it's better to have a unified world where anyone can go anywhere. Clearly, though, we're at the stage of the world where anyone can go anywhere. Even Burma has lightened up recently. It used to prohibit tourism right into our own lifetime as a remnant of that hermit kingdom type of policy. And obviously now we have internet and we have international distribution of this, that, and the other thing. And this is a problem we have to deal with because we don't know exactly always how to react to that, and I can't provide solutions. But on the dialogical aspect of it, I can certainly say certain principles that must operate if we are to live in a peaceful, pluralistic world. So one of them is to recognize and honor the other, and to allow the other to represent itself. Now, of course, I don't always do this because I teach world religions, so I'm representing, 13 other religions, and I'm not from them. But I try to compensate for that by ordering books which have articles written by practitioners of those religions themselves, rather than just some homogenizing textbook. Although I use those too because faute de mieux, there's nothing else. I mean, there's better books and worse books, and so, well, you all know that about having to choose books and what kind of sources you'll rely on when you're teaching. And the second rule would be this, that it's very vitally important and often not observed, including by the Muslims, to not compare one's own ideals with the other's actions. This is very commonly what is done. One compares one's own ideals with the actions of the other. And that's not really legitimate. Ideals should be compared with ideals and actions with actions. That would be fairer and more accurate if one did things like that. Obviously, Islam, from my point of view, has something to gain from the application of these principles, because it would mean that Muslims would be able to represent Islam. And on the whole, in the American media, Muslims have not been allowed to represent Islam. Of course, Muslims are allowed to create their own media products and distribute those because we have press freedom. But in the major networks and so on, the whole discourses about things are rather carefully constructed. And you will all have to admit that on the whole, more often than not, Islam is represented by Christian or Jewish or non-religious spokesmen or spokespersons of non-Muslim origin than it is by Muslims. Or, if it is represented by Muslims, often they are people with foreign appearances and accents who are used as foils by the moderator or the interviewer to portray an unfavorable view of the religion of Islam. And I can point to particular interviews where that has been the case. And on the other hand, what the other communities gain from that is that if the Muslims themselves also adopt these principles and allow the other religions to represent themselves instead of representing them, then the pact will be mutual, and there will be a two-way traffic on that point. For example, when we speak of the Palestine question, or the conflict of Israel and Palestine, which a Jew would describe as the land of Israel question, if anything, it is the case that the land of Israel is an important aspect of the ancient Judaic law, and it has been on the books for 2,000 years. In fact, more than that, because it's described in the Torah. And quite apart from whether the Jews actually had any historical presence on that land for much of its history or not, which is a point that may be disputed from either side, nevertheless, it's on the books as a significant concept in the Jewish religion. And so that's something that exists. And I admit that and state that. And that is something that can clearly be seen. And so to forward the discussion, then, one has to kind of listen to the other. And people are often not willing to do that. And on the Muslim side, that is the case as well. I mean, I can cite things that, would not impress you favorably about what Muslims think about the West in this, that, or the other respect. Some of these things come about through ignorance and so forth. But there's certainly room for improvement on this on all sides. And I think everyone can see that. Another thing is that, maybe to wrap up, would be that certainly it is possible for different viewpoints to contribute to each other. That is, obviously throughout history there have been a mixture of viewpoints, and things have gotten information, knowledge, and so on. Different trends in different societies have taken knowledge from other places. And that usually has been beneficial, even when it's created dissension and discord and trouble. It's usually been beneficial because it has stirred things up and stirred up thinking, and stops society from falling into a kind of a static mode, or a fixed or hardened, ossified mode where the creativity might be more limited. The idea of having some kind of cross-pollination and cross-fertilization, it's good, it's beneficial. Now, it's true that a lot of Muslims will probably view this as not very desirable, what I'm saying, and would think that, well, we should rather, cut ourselves off from the world more and try to be isolated and build walls around ourselves to a greater extent, and so on. And that has a certain desirability from the puristic aspect, because if someone is thinking of their religion in the sense of a pure thing, and they want to purify it in every respect that they possibly can, so that they would then isolate themselves from the world. But it has obviously very serious downsides as well. And it is against the current of things, where things are very mixed up and there's a great deal of pluralism in the world. So in the end, I guess I would not recommend that, and would recommend more dialogue. And also another point I want to make is that the end of purpose of dialogue cannot be to establish that some single way is right. That can't be, because then it doesn't become dialogue. It becomes something coercive and subordinating. That wouldn't be acceptable. It has to be something where you don't expect the end product to be the submission or conversion of the other. And therefore, it has to be, in the end, a kind of recognition of pluralism. There's not any other end product that can be imagined to be arrived at. In pluralistic world, that's something that we would have to be looking for in this. For the Muslims, from my point of view, that's a benefit, because given the power relationships that exist in the world, a non-pluralistic dominating ideology in the world will almost certainly be deleterious to the lives and livelihoods of the Muslims in the world. if that were to take place. And I hope that it would not take place. Okay, so I think I'll stop there and see if you have any questions or comments or anything. Yes, please.
This is something I'm sure you can come up with exceptions to the rule, but it seems like so often the Middle East, North Africa, those countries, you're talking about a lack of democracy as far as, well, yes, there's a legislative branch in Saudi Arabia, but they serve at the pleasure of the king. Why has that area of the world never seemed to have prospered as far as having a democratically elected government? Are they so, I wanted to say, I mean, to us, that would seem like a worthy goal. Apparently, why is that not?
Well, most areas in the world haven't really had democratic government or long experience with that. I mean, first of all, could you say that China really ever had a parliamentary system? I mean, if you tried to point to the nationalist period, Chiang Kai-shek was a sort of a mafioso type dictator. He was terrible. And then obviously the communist regime hasn't had anything we would recognize as democracy. So since the period before Chiang Kai-shek was civil war, and then before that Manchu Empire, that's not had it either. And that's a very substantial part of the world and its population. And if you said Latin America, well, yes, but Latin America is part of the Western tradition, more or less. And of course, it's also not always been honored, democracy there, but at least you could say it's been sometimes honored. And the Middle Eastern countries, first of all, there are more practical democratic aspects in the countries there than often meets the eye. Now, except Saudi Arabia, which you mentioned, actually, although you kind of called that a parliament at the pleasure of the king, and I may have said something like that, but it's really the consultative council. Really, it has no legislative power at all. I mean, there's simply no parliamentary regime in Saudi Arabia and never has been. So that would exactly fit what you're saying in that particular case. But other countries are quite other than that. The Iranian parliament, since the revolution, has been a very lively place. And that has been, full of opposition against the government, although that doesn't get filtered over here. And Iran doesn't have a dictator because there isn't any single dictatorial figure there in that country. Of course, it was also true that at one point, as far as women went, that for a period of 2 years, Tansu Çiller was the prime minister of Turkey, and Benazir Bhutto was the prime minister of Pakistan, and Khalid Zia was the prime minister of Bangladesh, collectively ruling 1/4 of the Muslims under them, and they were 3 women. And they only got to their positions in each case through an electoral process. And that electoral process has gone with fits and starts in various places, so that there are military coups that come back and so forth. And then sometimes the governments are less democratic than they appear on the surface, although they veer this way and that way somewhat. Like in Egypt, for example, there was a parliamentary democracy during, well, it was never really quite a full one, but it was pretty lively for part of its time, especially from the years 1933 to 1952, under the British protectorate, in effect, and the kings. And then after that, it's been a fairly dictatorial and military regime, although it's frequently had elections and, it has had intermittently a certain amount of press freedom. In fact, the Egyptians' press freedom is something like that is typical of many of the countries, is that the ruler cannot be criticized in the press, the high ruler, but everybody else can be. Even the ministers in the government and so on can be criticized. And so that certainly gives you an opening to criticize the government. And Morocco has quite a fairly liberal system. It is rather more parliamentary than before, and especially the new king has said that he means to be like Juan Carlos of Spain. That is, to just be a constitutional monarch with not any effect on the day-to-day running of the state. Jordan has had very free elections, although the Muslim parties boycotted the last elections there, but it has had what has been recognized as a more liberal type of parliamentary regime. And then you have other things like the eradicators in Algeria are dictatorial. Tunisia is dictatorial in much the same sense as Egypt, in that it has some window dressing but not any real democracy. And Libya has been a rather dictatorial state, and so on. So some of them have had more of that kind of history, but it's not completely without democratic side also. So
yeah, I realize the exceptions. This seemed like more times than not to me. You look north of the Mediterranean, you look south of the Mediterranean.
Yeah, the north of the Mediterranean is Europe, and that has gone through a completely different history. And if you look outside of Europe on the whole, for the most places, you don't see it as being completely democratic. And if you looked at India, which is sometimes called the world's largest democracy, which, although it has obviously dominated by Hindus and Hinduism, this is 82% of the people there, but the population is also at least 11 or 12% Muslim. And they do vote in the elections too, especially they go out and vote against the Hindu nationalist parties that want to hurt their interests. And yet that has certain limitations on it as well, because the government has often dissolved state governments and ruled by decree, and you wouldn't find that the case here. So you wouldn't say that would be either quite a democracy on the American lines. Not quite, although still it's, you can argue that it's been a fairly good thing as well. Anything else? Usually I wait with my students, and because sometimes waiting helps. But of course, if you want to go and get ready to go to Santa Fe, then that's another matter. All right, thank you.